Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Route 1 Rundown. I'm your host, Steve Gorgie, and I'm thrilled to be back for another episode to talk some Terps. But before I get into all of that, just a reminder that this show is on YouTube and part of the Department of Hoops, a DMV media network. So if you're listening to the show, but you'll want to watch it, then you gotta go to YouTube. That's youtube.com/@Department of Hoops. Hit that podcast tab, and you'll see all the episodes of this show. You'll also see a ton of other great content on that YouTube page. If you love local basketball, then you're going to love the Department of Hoops. And no matter where you're listening, please like the episodes, leave a comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share it with somebody else who loves Maryland basketball, because all of that stuff really does help the show grow, but nothing helps it more than you sharing it with a friend, somebody who really may genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. You can also find me all across the internet at the same handle. It's at Gorg on Sports. You can find me on Twitter, on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, again, at Gorg on Sports. I'm doing this 295 Sports Minute series, the biggest stories in Baltimore, DC, and everywhere in between in 1 minute or less. That's all across social media, so make sure you check it out. Also talking tons of Maryland basketball, Maryland football, national college basketball, national college football, sports gambling. I'm talking about it all. So again, make sure you check me out at Gorgon Sports all across the internet. But without further ado, let's dive into today's show. And today, I want to talk a little bit about the players who are and aren't honored in the rafters right now at the Xfinity Center, and how I may change things. What I would do if I was the czar of basketball, if I was running things at Maryland in College Park, if I had my say on how we would put players' names and numbers in the rafters, how would I do it a little bit differently? I like the sound of czar of Maryland basketball. That's a nice title. That's a job I might be interested in. Well, if that was me, how would I do things, and who might be honored that's not right now? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But before I get into that, let's start today's show with some quick hitters. A couple news topics, a couple things going on with Maryland basketball that I'm going to talk about kind of in rapid fire fashion here. So without further ado, let's get into it, and let's start with Maryland's new commit since the last time we spoke. It's Collin Metcalf. He's a 6'9", rising senior from Northeastern. And last year, he was top 10 nationally in blocks per game, averaged 2.4 blocks per game. And that's really the thing that you need to know about him. This is a guy who can add a little depth on the inside on the defensive end. A good shot blocker, a good rebounder, a good defender. He was the 7th highest rated player defensively, according to Evan Maya, in the CAA last year. He's a guy who can add something, who can bring something to the table, hopefully on the defensive end. He was all defensive team in the CAA a season ago, and it's a guy who just did it consistently throughout the year in that league. He tries to take a step up to the Big Ten. That it's certainly a much more competitive league. It's certainly a much more physical league, but what you're looking for with Collin Metcalf is if he can just provide some depth, provide 5 fouls, and be a guy who provides a little bit of energy in Big Ten play. Be a guy who you know you're going to need depth. You know you're going to need bodies with the physicality of this league. Can he provide a rim protecting presence? That's what you're hoping that he brings to the table. Now, if you're looking for more on Collin Metcalf, then you got to go and check out the Inside Maryland Sports radio feed, wherever you get your podcast. Matt Moderno, who does a great job running the Department of Hoops, he also does a podcast on that feed. It's the Fear the Podcast show, and it's on that Inside Maryland Sports radio feed. He had Collin Metcalf on the show. He talked to him. Great interview there. It's worth your listen. It's worth a listen if you're looking for more details about Collin Metcalf and who he is and what he's hoping to bring to the Terps next season as Maryland continues to build out that roster in Buzz Williams' first year at the helm. Let's move on to the next piece of news, and that's that Maryland has a new athletic director officially. His name is Jim Smith. He was announced officially about a week ago, and then he did an introductory press conference today on Thursday, May 22nd, just a couple hours ago as I record this. What you need to know about Jim Smith, who takes over, of course, for Damon Evans, who accepted the same role at SMU earlier this year. Jim Smith comes from the sports business world. Most recently, the SVP of Business Strategy for the Atlanta Braves, worked for AMB Sports, which is Arthur Blank's company, which runs the Mercedes-Benz Dome, the Atlanta Falcons, Atlanta United, was an executive there, spent time working for the Columbus Crew, and then in the college ranks, he worked for Ohio State for a time. He was the president and CEO of Ohio State's Alumni Association. If you know anything about Ohio State, you know it is a huge school with a huge alumni base, and also spent some time in the athletic department where he was associate AD of marketing and communications. The hiring of Jim Smith follows a very common trend that we've seen over the past couple of years as college sports has become more and more professionalized. And it's going out and getting somebody with experience in professional sports. There was a time, there was a day and age where to be a conference commissioner, to be a athletic director at a Power 5 school, Power 4 school, you had to have kind of climbed your way through the ranks in college athletic administration. You had to have worked your way up the ladder, worked at a small school, worked at a bigger school, then went back to a smaller school as the AD there before you could get a job like the athletic director at Maryland, before you could become something like the commissioner of the Big Ten. Well, look no further than the commissioner of the Big Ten, Tony Petitti, who was hired from outside the college sports realm. Look no further than Brett Yormark, the commissioner of the Big 12, who was hired from outside the college sports realm. These are two people that come from professional sports because at this point, this is what college sports is. College sports is professional sports. It's only going to become more and more professionalized. And I totally understand and get the desire to go out and get somebody with experience in that field, with experience doing all the things you do when you run a professional sports franchise, or when you're trying to monetize a professional sports franchise, when you're trying to increase revenue. That is the name of the game in college sports right now. I think one of the first things that Jim Smith was asked at the press conference today was about NIL and his strategy for NIL. That is what this is all about at this point. So this really fits a trend that we've been seeing in college sports over the past couple of years, where rather than going out and getting somebody who spent a career in college athletics administration, schools and conferences are focused on finding people with experience in professional sports, because that's what college sports really have become, and I think will only continue to become in the years ahead. And the last piece of news here is Maryland target Sebastian Wilkins will be deciding on Friday afternoon between Maryland and Duke. Now, Wilkins is a class of 2026 guy at the moment. He plays at Brewster Academy, and he is technically a rising senior, but he is a very likely candidate to reclassify, regardless of whether he chooses Maryland or Duke, and will likely play next college basketball season. Wilkins is a guy who really screams Buzz Williams when you look at his profile. A 6'8 power forward. He's a guy who's number 32 in the 24/7 sports rankings, number 27 in the composite rankings. When you read the profiles of him, when you hear people talk about his game, it's his length, it's his defensive prowess, it's his versatility on the defensive end, it's the fact that he can get to the basket. He has shown the ability, he's shown flashes that he can be a good shooter, but that's not necessarily what his game is all about at this time. It's a guy who just seems like, under Buzz Williams, you are going to see time and time again a ton of these 6'8 guys. It seems like that is right in Buzz Williams' wheelhouse, and that's what the kind of guy, the kind of player that Sebastian Wilkins seems to be. If Maryland does go out and ultimately land Wilkins, it sounds like a lot of the credit can be given to Wabisa Bede, who is on Buzz Williams' staff. Wilkins gave a quote not too long ago where he talked about having that relationship with Bede. So that'll be an interesting one to watch there. That could be another guy who will be a contributor to this ever-growing Maryland roster. It's a really interesting Maryland roster. I still think the biggest question mark on this team is shooting. I still think another question mark is the size inside, whether they have enough bulk for the Big Ten. But what I think you will have, and Wilkins would only add to this, is a lot of athleticism, a lot of length, and a team that can be very flexible defensively, very versatile defensively, and certainly some guys that can get to the basket. So this would be another big-time commitment for Maryland. Certainly anytime you can beat Duke and John Shire in a recruiting battle, that's a very, very good thing. He will be announcing his commitment on Friday, May 23rd. If you're listening to the show, it's very likely today. You can, if you want to check it out, it's going to be 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Friday, May 23rd, on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. So go and check that out and see if the Terps can land Sebastian Wilkins and continue to complete this roster that is looking pretty intriguing. Certainly some holes. It's not a perfect roster, but it's a pretty intriguing roster when you think about the fact that there will not be a single player returning from last year's teams. Okay, those are the quick hitters. Those are the news and notes. Let's get into our main topic today. And this came up a little bit during the season as Derek Queen was having this unbelievable year, a record-setting season, one of the best freshman seasons we've ever seen at the University of Maryland. I was thinking a lot about the players who are honored, why those players are honored, and the fact that when you look up in the rafters at Xfinity Center, the last player who was honored was Gravis Vasquez, who last played a game at Maryland in 2010. The last time a Maryland player that's honored in the rafters actually played a game was 15 years ago. Basically, what I think that says to Maryland fans is that the last 15 years haven't been noteworthy. They haven't mattered. They haven't been important. And while I would certainly agree the last 15 years have not been necessarily lived up to my expectations, they haven't been exactly what I've wanted, there's certainly been more pain than pleasure over those 15 years. I would also argue there are players, there are moments that are worth celebrating. I mean, there's an entire generation of Maryland fans, that's all they've seen. There's an entire generation of Maryland fans at this point that really don't remember the Gary Williams years, and certainly don't remember the height of the Gary Williams years. After all, 2002 was now 23 years ago at this point. So I'm talking about people who maybe grew up out of state, were not Maryland basketball fans, went to Maryland for school, watched those Mello Trimble teams, watched some of those Turgeon teams that were good, not great, but had some big wins along the way, had some moments along the way, and now are, I don't know, 7, 8 years out of school. That's their era of Maryland basketball. And I feel like that era is not properly represented in the rafters right now. When you talk about the rafters, when you talk about players being honored, my feeling on it is this: it should be like a museum. If you took somebody to a game, whether it's a child who's just learning about Maryland basketball, getting into Maryland basketball, or maybe it's a friend who's a fan of another program, another team, isn't so familiar with Maryland basketball and its history, my feeling is you should be able to sit there in Xfinity Center. You should be able to point to the rafters, and that should tell the story of Maryland basketball. It should be almost as a museum to Maryland basketball. And right now, I don't feel like the players and the numbers in the rafters truly accurately represent the whole story of Maryland basketball. So if I was the czar of Maryland basketball, if it was up to me, if I was making these decisions, here is what I would do. I would have a couple rules. One, if you are named a first, second, or third team All-American, you are automatically in the rafters. You automatically get your jersey, get your number honored. Now, I think you can make the argument, should that be restricted to the AP? I'm fine with that. There's a lot of All-American lists out there. I would be totally fine with the AP being used. If you're first, second, or third team AP, then you automatically go in the rafters. If you win the Conference Player of the Year award, you automatically are honored and get your name and number up in the rafters. Those would be the two automatics for me. No matter what else happens in your career at Maryland, if you accomplish one of those two things, first, second, or third team AP All-American or Conference Player of the Year, you automatically get your name up in the rafters. The other way you could make it up there, the other way you could get honored would be if you provide an exceptional contribution to Maryland basketball. Exceptional contributions to Maryland basketball would be the other way that you can be honored. Now, how I would do this is you would have to wait 5 years after you played your last game at Maryland. Then you would be eligible for 5 more seasons, and there would be a committee made up of former players, one prominent former coach that I can think of, Gary Williams, other people who are prominently involved and invested in the basketball program. I would form I would form an informed committee of people who know and care about Maryland basketball to vote on this. I also think this could be a cool way to just generate excitement every offseason. Imagine, every offseason for Maryland fans, it's like, all right, who's eligible to go up in the rafters this year? Who's eligible to be honored? They weren't an All-American. They didn't win Conference Player of the Year, but I think this guy has a really strong case. That would be a really fun thing, and then Maryland could put out a press release in the summer every year for a non-conference game. You could make it the honoree night. Lord knows they need to do something to increase attendance and generate a little excitement for some of those non-conference games. I think that would be a really fun thing. And that's how I would go about doing this. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, right now, there are 18 players who are honored in the rafters. I'm not going to run through them all, but I'll say it again. Gravis Vasquez, who last played in 2010, is the most recent player up there. There's not a single player who played under Mark Turgeon up in those rafters right now. Based on the criteria I just laid out, there are a couple players who are not honored at the moment who would be. First is Jalen Smith. So Jalen Smith, in the 2020 season, he was named third team AP All-American. That would, in my book, immediately, automatically put him up there. And he was third team AP All-American. He was third team All-American on a bunch of other lists as well. The National Association of Basketball Coaches, U.S. Basketball Writers Association, a bunch of them. But I think AP is a fair one to use. When I think All-American, I always think AP All-American. Let me know what you think. Do you think other lists should be allowed? What's your thought on that? I think AP All-American is fine, and I think Jalen Smith would deserve to be up there. Look, Jalen Smith, I think, might be one of the more underrated Maryland basketball players of the last 20 years, and I'm not exactly sure why. He was a guy who was a very highly touted recruit. He came in with high expectations. He largely delivered on those expectations. He was part of a team that won Maryland's first ever Big Ten regular season championship. It was a 3-way tie, but it was a championship. He was a huge part of that team. He's a local guy. He ended up being a first-round draft pick. Jalen Smith sticks. He largely delivered, and I think he would be very deserving to be up there. I think when you tell the story of Maryland basketball, Jalen Smith, a huge part of that. The other guy who would automatically be on that list, who automatically would be honored, is a guy that we're very intimately familiar with because he was just here, and it's Derek Queen. He was named third team AP All-American this past season. Of course, he was also Big Ten Freshman of the Year. Derek Queen had one of the best freshman seasons we've ever seen at Maryland. He hit one of the biggest shots of the last 25 years at Maryland, and I wholeheartedly would agree that when you tell the story of Maryland basketball, you got to talk about Derek Queen. So no problem at all with either of those two guys, two Baltimore guys, going up in the rafters automatically by the nature of being named third team AP All-Americans. Now, here's why I say AP All-American, because if you extend it to some of these other lists, and I'm looking at Maryland basketball's official record book right now, there's another guy that pops up. In 2011, Jordan Williams was named third-team All-American by Fox Sports and third-team All-American by Yahoo Sports. Now, Jordan Williams was a very, very good player. Key contributor on the 2010 team, one of my favorite teams of all time, his freshman season. And then he took it on a huge role in 2011 on a very bad team. That was Gary Williams' last team. It was not a good team. They went 7-9 in the ACC. They missed the NCAA tournament. But Jordan Williams, he did have a great year, and he was named third-team All-American by those two publications. Nearly 17 points per game, nearly 12 rebounds per game on a bad team. Now, look, I could live, my whole thing with this is I can live with being more inclusive. I can live with having more players up there, even if some of them you might feel like are questionable. But Jordan Williams, when I look at him, when I look at what he did at Maryland, and I'm not even taking into account any of his off-the-court legal troubles following his Maryland career, I'm not so sure that he feels like a guy that should be honored in the rafters. I think you can tell the story of Maryland basketball without talking about Jordan Williams. So I feel like that's partly why I would like to limit this to AP All-Americans. First, second, and third team AP All-Americans as far as your automatic qualifier status, and then Conference Player of the Year. And look, when you talk about Conference Player of the Year, Maryland has not had very many of those guys. In the history of Maryland basketball, the Conference Players of the Year have been Albert King, Len Bias twice, Joe Smith, Juan Dixon, and Gravis Vasquez. And all of those guys are in the rafters. So the Conference Player of the Year part of this wouldn't add anybody at the moment. But I think if you win Conference Player of the Year, you should automatically be up there. So based on my criteria, we'd add Jalen Smith and Derek Queen up there by virtue of being third team AP All-Americans. Now, I have three more guys that I think should be added, and they would have to be added via my exceptional contribution to Maryland basketball stipulation. The first, I don't think this will come as any surprise, is Melo Trimble. He's a guy who was named to all Big Ten teams all 3 years he was at Maryland. He's in Maryland's top 15 on the all-time scoring list, and he is a guy who took Maryland basketball out of the doldrums in a lot of ways. Maryland basketball was in a really dark place when Melo Trimble showed up on campus. Maryland had not made a tournament since 2010. He showed up in the fall of 2014, took Maryland to the NCAA tournament in their first year in the Big Ten, and I felt like really revitalized, rejuvenated Maryland basketball in a way we hadn't seen in a long time. And that's where that exceptional contribution to Maryland basketball stipulation comes in. I don't think you can tell the story of Maryland basketball right now without talking about Melo Trimble. For a whole generation of Maryland fans, Melo Trimble was their guy. Melo Trimble was the guy who hit big shots. Melo Trimble was the guy who provided big moments. Melo Trimble was the man on those teams. And while they weren't great teams, they weren't national championship teams, they weren't Final Four teams, Maryland, since the year 2000, let's not say since the year 2000, since winning the national championship in 2002, Maryland still has only been to 3 Sweet 16s. It was in 2003, 2016, and this year, 2025. Melo Trimble was the best player on that 2016 team. So I believe that it's disingenuous and it's disrespectful to a whole generation of Maryland fans if you don't include Melo Trimble. Melo Trimble was a very, very good player, all Big Ten, all 3 years he was there, and he contributed to winning teams. He revitalized Maryland basketball in a lot of ways, and he was an excellent player. And I think that's the kind of guy that's missing right now. That's why the rafters are incomplete. That's why those honorees are incomplete. Again, those teams weren't national championship caliber teams, but they were very good teams. Over his 3 years, second in the Big Ten his freshman year, fourth in the Big Ten his sophomore year, or tied for third, I should say, and tied for second his junior year. They were top-tier Big Ten teams. They won some big games. They got to a Sweet 16, and he was by and large the reason why. So I say Melo Trimble deserves to be honored up in the rafters at Xfinity Center under the exceptional contribution to Maryland basketball by law. The next guy is his successor at point guard, Anthony Cowan, another guy who was an excellent player at Maryland. 3-time All Big Ten. He's in the top 10 in Maryland's all-time scoring list, and he was one of the best players on Maryland's first ever Big Ten regular season championship team. Now, of course, that 2020 season, the Big Ten tournament and NCAA tournament were canceled, so we don't know what kind of postseason success that team could have had, that Anthony Cowan could have had. But Anthony Cowan was one of the best players, was a leader on a team that accomplished something that hadn't been done at Maryland before, which was winning the Big Ten regular season title. Again, I know it was a shared title. I know Maryland basketball has not been in the Big Ten very long in the grand scheme of things, but winning a regular season conference title is meaningful. Winning the first regular season conference title in a new league is meaningful. That's part of the story of Maryland basketball. And then when you combine it with the fact that he was an excellent player, that he was a guy that stayed 4 years, that he was a guy who's in the top 10 all time in Maryland's career scoring list, to me it's a no-brainer. Anthony Cowan goes up in the rafters. You honor him and his number under the exceptional contributions to the Maryland basketball program by law. The final guy that I think would be honored under that stipulation, under that bylaw, be a guy that just finished up his career. And it's Julian Reese. Now, Julian Reese is an interesting case because in Julian Reese's entire Maryland career, Julian Reese was never first, second, or third team all-conference. He was honorable mention a bunch of times. I want to bring up exactly how often he was Big Ten honorable mention. I know he was this past season. I believe he was in 2024 as well. Big Ten honorable mention in 2024 as well. 2023 too. So 3 years Big Ten honorable mention. A lot of guys are Big Ten honorable mention though. This one is a little more personal, I think. This one is, you really got to dig in a little bit more because Julian Reese, and I've talked about it so much throughout the season, I think his contribution to this program is hard to describe because it comes down a lot to loyalty and the way he stuck with this program through all these changes. He had every opportunity to leave, and he was a stabilizing force for this Maryland basketball program. And then when you look at his career stats, he's in the top 20 in scoring at number 20. He's the number 2 rebounder of all time. He's number 9 in career blocks. He is a guy who put up some really good numbers, who was a stabilizing force at a time where there was not a lot of stability with Maryland basketball. He's a huge part of this team that just went to the Sweet 16. And ultimately, I think this matters in this new era. He's a guy that played at Maryland for 4 years. I think a career like that is worth honoring. I get it if you want to make the argument Julian Reese never even made first, second, or third team all-conference. How can you put him up there? And to that, I would just say, I think he provided more to this program than initially meets the eye. I think the stability that he provided during this very short Kevin Willard era is really important. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we look back at this 3-year Kevin Willard run, because certainly by the time that Mark Turgeon left, I think everybody who roots for Maryland was ready for that experience to end. And Willard's era was short, but relatively successful. 2 NCAA tournament appearances, of course, a Sweet 16, and one of the most memorable shots in Maryland basketball history by Derek Queen. But I don't think either of those NCAA tournament appearances really happen without Julian Reese. And maybe it's recency bias, maybe it's a little bit of that. But I just think in this era where you are seeing so much movement, where it's so rare for somebody to stick around for 4 years, for Julian Reese to stick around for 4 years with the coaching changes, with the assistant coaching changes, with bringing in a guy like Derek Queen at his position, and he said, no, I want to stay here and I want to help this team win. I think it's so important. And then when you add to the fact the career stats that he did put up, I would be perfectly fine with Julian Reese in the rafters. I think what the rafters should be all about, what the honored names and numbers should be all about, is telling that story of Maryland basketball, honoring great players, honoring great seasons, honoring great careers. And I think there's enough room up there for a guy like Derek Queen, who came in, had one great All-American season, and then left, and a guy like Julian Reese, who over 4 years worked his way up all these lists, scoring, rebounding, blocks. I think there is room for both. So under my proposal, Jalen Smith and Derek Queen would automatically be added to the list. I would also add Melo Trimble, Anthony Cowan, and Julian Reese right now. But I want to hear what you think. Hit me up on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok. Hit me up in the comments here. Tell me what you think. Leave a 5-star review and tell me what you think. Who should be added to the rafters? Who should be honored next? Is it a problem for you that Maryland hasn't honored anybody since Gravis Vasquez, who last played in 2010? For me, it is. For me, I think you're not telling the whole story of Maryland basketball. Those are the 5 players that I would add. It would bring the total to 23, and I don't think that's outrageous at all. I would much rather err on the side of adding more players, of being more complete in telling that story, than have it be too sparse, to have to win a national championship and be an All-American to have your name up there. And I'm not saying that's the criteria right now, but it feels closer to that than it does a museum of Maryland basketball that honors the great players, the great seasons, the great moments, the great careers, that tells the story of Maryland basketball. So once again, Jalen Smith and Derek Queen would automatically go up to me because they were All-Americans. They're both third-team All-Americans. And I would add Melo Trimble, Anthony Cowan, and Julian Reese under my exceptional contributions to Maryland basketball by law. That's the show for today. Hey, before you shut this thing off, I just want to let you know I recorded a really fun podcast with Matt Moderno on that Inside Maryland Sports radio feed, the Fear the Podcast show. That's going to be coming out sometime next week. We did a little draft. We each drafted a team of 9 players who played in the year 2000 on. So over the last 25 years, we had to draft 3 Gary guys, 3 Turgeon guys, and 3 Willard guys to try to make our best Maryland basketball team for the modern era. It was a really fun show, really good conversation, matched unbelievable on all things local hoops. Great Maryland basketball historian, has so much knowledge of the local hoop scene, Maryland basketball, the Wizards, the NBA. I mean, there's not a bigger hoops junkie out there than Matt, so it was a ton of fun to record that with him. Make sure you go and check that out. Again, that's the Inside Maryland Sports podcast feed. It should be coming out sometime next week. It was a really fun conversation. Next week, there will be no show, but after that, things are really going to heat up. I'm going to start diving in to this off-season Big Ten preview series, looking at what's been going on in the Big Ten over the course of the offseason. Of course, always talking Terps news, but also spending some time diving into what Maryland's competition in the Big Ten has done. Maryland, of course, has had a ton of turnover, but so have other Big Ten schools. Iowa, Indiana, they are also programs that have turned over their rosters. There's so much going on in college basketball and in the Big Ten. My goal over the course of the summer is to really dive in those teams so that when Maryland squares off with Michigan next season, when Maryland takes on Indiana, you know exactly who those guys are, what they bring to the table, and how Maryland matches up. So really looking forward to diving into some of those schools now that the transfer portal season is kind of coming to the close. Of course, there's still few names out there. We got the NBA draft ahead too. There's some stay or go decisions, but for the most part, rosters are starting to get set. I want to start diving into those Big Ten schools. Really excited to do that, and of course, always talking the latest Terps news. That's the show for today. Until next time, this has been the Route One Rundown.